From CSDC, the Charter Schools Development Center.
The original concept was charter schools were going to kind of be free to innovate, and it was going to be kind of like the free and open field where you could go plant your charter seed. But over time, it's gotten a lot more complex.
Welcome to Boarding Pass, your ticket to effective charter school governance. I'm Caitlin O'Halloran Heller, and more than 20 years ago, I got the bright idea that I was going to start a charter school. My son was in preschool, and I wanted to create a free Montessori charter school as a public education option in my small rural community. I actually said the words. I mean, how hard can it be? And 2 decades later, I know exactly how hard it is to build and maintain a high-quality charter school in California. So I'm going to take you down the path that I went down and help you with everything you need to know to excel as a board member in a thriving charter school. Today, I am thrilled to introduce to you my colleague, Eric Premack, the visionary founder and executive director of the Charter Schools Development Center. For over 3 decades, Eric has been on the forefront of educational reform, tirelessly advocating for innovative approaches to public education. His expertise in education policy and charter school law has not only shaped education legislation across the country, but has also been instrumental in guiding countless charter school leaders to success. Eric also served on 2 charter school boards, so he knows what it's like to traverse all the complexities of charter school governance. It's my honor to welcome a true pioneer in the charter school movement, Eric Premack. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Caitlin. Great to be with you here today.
Thanks. We're going to start we're going to do a little walk back in time. We're going to walk through the sort of topography of the public school landscape in the early 1990s. Can you sort of take us down that road a little bit and tell us what was going on and why charter schools were even being considered?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, the late 80s and early 90s in California were an era of very intense state control of local school districts. California had and still has a very long education code governing how school districts operate. And there was a very strong sense at the time among policymakers and other observers that the state control approach to education reform really wasn't working well and wasn't gaining traction. And at the time, there were efforts to allow schools, traditional public schools, to restructure, but those were sort of fizzling on the launch pad. And there was a really strong sense that something more powerful and fundamental was needed. And at the same time, the state had experienced a number of proposed voucher initiatives that would allow public funds to flow to private schools, and that was a very controversial concept. And so the concept of chartering was seen as something of a middle route that brought some of the reform powers to the table that we weren't seeing through traditional education reform efforts, and to allow for new and more innovative types of public education.
And what was the sort of vision for what that would look like, that innovative education? I actually read an article in the LA Times, like back right after the bill was signed, and it said Gary Hart had this idea that the charter schools were going to be sort of basic on the education front, but creative on other fronts, like teachers and kids might do the work of custodians. And I mean, of course, that's not how it played out, but what was the vision of the time of how those things might look?
You know, I don't know that anybody really knew. And Senator Hart, a few years later, said it was a little bit like throwing a party and not knowing who was going to show up. But I think originally the thought was that it would take the restructuring laws that were sort of fizzling on the launch pad and give them a little bit more fuel. But in practice, it really took off in a much stronger direction, and I think for the good.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's walk through that sort of taking off then. So, you have to have legislation to change that huge education code we're talking about. What did that look like? How did that process play out in the legislature?
Yeah, it was a pretty messy process, as the legislative process often is, and success often has 1,000 mothers. But the basic concept of chartering was that somebody other than a school district could control and operate a public school. And the concept came out of Minnesota, and California's legislation in 1992 was patterned very closely off of Minnesota's then new law that was enacted in 1991. The way it got through the legislative process is one of the most interesting stories in California legislative history. and ultimately culminated in some fast maneuvers on the Senate floor in the middle of a rare evening session, where a competing charter bill was already on the governor's desk, and it was thought that Senator Hart's version of the bill was dead, and Senator Hart, through a legislative sleight of hand, was able to revive his bill late that night on the Senate floor in 1992, and asked for immediate passage by the Senate and sent it directly to the governor's desk. And so two versions of charter school laws ended up on the governor's desk within a few days of one another. And then Governor Wilson was a strong supporter of Gary Hart's version of chartering, which I think most of us would consider kind of real charter schools, whereas the competing legislation was a much more watered down version. And we were very fortunate through that legislative sleight of hand that the Charter Schools Act of 1992 was enacted into law.
And the original version also had sort of a moratorium, right? It was just like 100 schools we were going to just start with and see how it kind of worked. And most of the education code was waived at that point. They called it the mega waiver, right?
It was an interesting law, in some ways very limited in terms of the numbers of schools that it allowed. It kept a cap of no more than 100 charter schools statewide, and no more than 10 within any given district. And that's a very low cap for a state like California that has several thousand schools. But that original law in many ways was super powerful, particularly in that it allowed for charter schools to be owned and governed independently from the traditional school district structure, and waived most of the laws that govern traditional school districts. And given that there were several thousand pages of laws, that was seen as quite radical at the time.
Absolutely. And so now when we look at it, and as you know, I served for 9 years on a traditional district board, but a lot of charter school board members don't have that sort of traditional district view. So now when we look at the differences, can you kind of walk me through the difference between a charter school and a traditional district school today?
Yeah. I think the most important difference is just that you're allowed to operate a public school outside of the district structure. And it's also important that we've had these waivers of many of the laws that govern traditional districts, and that allows a degree of innovation that we typically aren't allowed to engage in within the traditional district sector, although some of that flexibility has been eroded in the subsequent 30 years as the legislature has imposed some additional restrictions on charter schools. But it really, in my view, boils down to governance and the legal independence that charter schools have. That's what really gives the schools their long-term independence, and it's why governing boards for charter schools are so important.
You're absolutely right about governing boards being important, and that's one of the reasons, we're producing more information for boards at CSDC, and we're really trying to get folks to deepen their knowledge around that, because charter schools literally could not exist without charter school governing boards, right? I mean, they just wouldn't. It's a linchpin to the school's existence. And as governing boards, now in California, the governing boards are also the governing boards for a nonprofit corporation. And so can we walk through a little bit about what the nonprofit corporation is, what that means for board members?
Yeah. In simple terms, a nonprofit corporation is one of many different types of corporations that one might create in California and authorized under California's corporation codes. But the word nonprofit is a bit of a misnomer, since most nonprofit corporations do generate profits, although usually very small or modest profits. But a corporation is a form of a legal entity that allows individuals like charter school founders to get together and form an organization and have that organization as a free-standing entity that's larger than just a handful of people getting together, and allows them to function in a lot of important ways. The key difference between a nonprofit corporation and a for-profit corporation is that a nonprofit corporation is required to reinvest any profits that it might earn and dedicate all of its financial and other resources toward its charitable mission. In the case of a charter school, that's serving students and educating students. And this differs from a for-profit corporation that is allowed to take profits and distribute them to individual shareholders or owners. And California's law generally requires charter schools to either form as or be operated by a nonprofit corporation, except in instances where they function as the arm of a public entity like a school district or a public college or a university.
Okay, and so when they operate as part of a school district, we use a term sometimes that we call them a dependent charter school, as opposed to an independent charter school. And although I know that doesn't exist really anywhere in law, can you give me sort of a brief definition of the ties that bind when you're in a district-run charter school as opposed to an independent charter school?
Yes. All charter schools have some degree of relationship to the local school district structure. Most charter schools, the ones that are formed as nonprofit corporations, which is the vast majority of them, operate in a highly independent fashion. They're independently governed, they're independent legal entities, and they typically manage their finances, personnel, instructional programs, etc., independent of the district. There are, however, a number of what we call dependent charter schools, and while the law doesn't speak directly nor use the term dependent, there are a number of them in practice, and these schools typically are formed as a legal arm of the school district. They typically enjoy a higher degree of flexibility than a traditional district-run school, but enjoy some higher degree of independence, but perhaps, and in many cases, less so than a typical charter school that is formed as a legally independent entity.
But both the independent charter schools and the dependent charter schools have a charter school board, right? Separate from their authorizing board, which is either the school district or the county office of education or something like that, right?
Typically, yes, they do. But there are some dependent charter schools where the charter says that the governing board of the district serves also simultaneously as the board of the dependent charter school. And I call those highly dependent or tightly held dependent. And then there are other dependent charter schools that have their own board or an advisory committee that the district board has delegated powers to. Nowadays, the for-profit structure of charter schools in California is prohibited. And so all charter schools in California either function as these dependent charter schools that we just described, or the bulk of them are formed as or operate as nonprofit corporations.
Great. Okay. And also when we talk about charter schools, there's a huge variance in size, right? Whether there's just one charter school that operates independently. So the one that I talk about in the intro of having co-founded, that charter school is just one charter school by itself and it's an independent charter school. But there's something called a charter management organization or a CMO, which might operate a lot of charter schools. And what does that look like?
Yeah, a CMO is a term that we use for charter management organization, an acronym. And essentially it's used to describe organizations that operate more than one charter school. So originally, most charter schools were single charter schools that were formed as a single corporation and were relatively, simple and streamlined as a legal entity. Over time, we've had networks of schools that might operate under a single corporation or might be formed as multiple nonprofit corporations that work in tandem with one another. And we use this charter management organization term as an umbrella term to describe these different types of legal structures that operate multiple schools, and they are sometimes a single corporation and are relatively simple in their legal form. Other CMOs are more complicated and might involve several corporations.
And for our listeners, in the show notes, we've linked a slide deck which goes over a lot of the information we're talking about as well. And Eric came up with some slides that are in there that actually show you visually some of the variance in CMOs, the size of them, the structure of them, because there are, there is many, there's 1,300 charter schools. There's that many models of slightly different organizational structures, it feels like. And so those are in there for a little more information as well. And then when we talk about the legal structure of a charter school, how are charter schools sort of legally comprised? How does that work?
Typically what happens is the individuals, what I'll call the founding coffee clutch of individuals who are starting a charter school, as you did many years ago, will file what are known as articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. And once they file those articles, the corporation is sort of magically created under law. And then those founders get together and figure out how is it that we as a school want to operate our corporation from a governance status, from a governance level. And they'll typically draft a set of what are known as bylaws, which are essentially the operating rules of the governing board. Then they will approach a charter authorizer. In California, this is typically a school district, and will propose a school. And in order to do that, they have to put forward a document called a charter petition. And the charter petition contains about 17 required elements under law that generally describe what's the school going to be like, what's its instructional program. There's a key section in there for board members on how the organization will be governed, and a number of other key elements. And they petition the school district for approval. If they're approved, then they are authorized, essentially given a green light under law through the charter to form and operate a charter school.
And I've mentioned to you before, the original charter for the school that I founded was 16 pages long. And that seems, crazy in this day and age. And so the charter document, and if you're a board member and you're sitting on a charter school board and we tell you that's something you should look through, how many pages are charter school, are charters now when you want to open a charter school?
Yeah, they can really vary in length. On the short end, maybe several dozen pages. On the long end, particularly if you're petitioning for a charter in a large urban school district where everything is kind of a little more complicated, it can go on for several hundred pages and may have numerous appendices. So what used to be a relatively simple thing to do to start a charter school back in the early and mid 90s has now become a much more complex task in most areas. And it's important
Absolutely.
for board members to do everything they can within practical realities to try to understand these documents.
Yes. Well, and also to understand the laws, right? So everything from the federal constitution to the actual charter we were just talking about, the charter petition, the charter document, govern charter schools. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of those ways that, things like federal law and case law and charter documents, that they all sort of are things that board members should really pay attention to and understand that they're under the auspices of all of those entities.
Yeah, and it's complicated, and we're not asking charter school members to all be lawyers, although it can be helpful to have a lawyer or two on your board. But in simple terms, charter schools are subject to a range of different laws, starting at the high end. The federal constitution and state constitution are sort of the supreme law of our land, if you will. And there are key provisions in each of those constitutions that charter schools need to be aware of. It could range from basic civil rights protections to other issues. And then as you move down the legal pecking order, we get into what's known as statutory law. These are the laws that the legislature and Congress promulgate, and they are codified in the statute books. And for example, here in California, there are several state sets of statutes, in particular the Education Code, but also the Corporations Code and the Labor Code and other state statutory laws that are important. Similar statutes at the federal level, particularly ones that relate to special education and federal funding programs that are important for charter schools to follow. And then as you move down the pecking order, we have regulatory law. These are laws that state and federal agencies like the Departments of Education will establish, usually to flesh out the statutory law, the details that are missing there. And there's also what's known as case law, and this is the form of law that emanates out of court decisions from appellate courts at the state and federal level, all the way up to the state and federal Supreme Court, that we need to be mindful. And while you don't have to memorize all of these or know all of these, one of the key roles that governing boards play is to make sure that schools are legally compliant. And over time, schools establish policies, procedures, and other practices that board members need to monitor to make sure they stay legally compliant over the long term.
And there's even some local laws, right? So zoning laws and things like that that you wouldn't think of sort of on the natural about a school being subject to, but there's those in the city, and then it's some of the rules and regulations that the school district has, maybe through an MOU. It's just really a huge amount of regulatory supervision of charter schools.
Yeah. The original concept was charter schools were going to kind of be free to innovate, and it was going to be kind of like a free and open field where you could go plant your charter seed. But over time, it's gotten a lot more complex, and we've gotten a lot more lawyers involved, for good or for ill. And this has made the job of governing a bit more complex, but there are also a lot more supports in place to help guide you as a board member.
True, yeah. And hopefully at CSDC, we provide some of those supports for board members as well. So as a board member, so you sit on two boards, or have sat on two different boards, charter school boards. You're in there day one, you need to look at the charter, and we call that one of the foundational documents. What other documents do you think board members should be reading, and how should they get those documents? Should they ask the lead administrator for those? How would they get those documents?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea for boards, when they have a new board member, to have, no pun intended, an onboarding process where they kind of bring that person up to speed on the key elements of how the charter school organization works and how it's governed. And that can include, giving them, if you will, a guided tour through the articles of incorporation, the key terms in the bylaws, the norms that the board usually uses when it conducts meeting and conducts board business, and then also the key terms of the actual charter petition itself, and what is it that the charter school has promised to the community and to the school district that authorized it, or the county board of education that authorized it. And it can also be helpful to walk them through, the key decisions that the board has recently made, perhaps over the prior year. And I kind of think of that as sort of the on-ramp onto the board chair. And if you give the person who's coming onto a board new that kind of a background onboarding process, they're going to be able to function much better and be much more informed as a board member.
Absolutely. And we actually at CSDC, we have a quick guide for onboarding board members. So I'll make sure we link that in the show notes as well. I was also going to say, and I don't know what you think about this, but one of my suggestions is that new board members get paired with a board mentor. So you have another board member who's there to answer all of the questions you're embarrassed to ask, maybe, about process or procedure, or even meeting times, or what's closed session. And maybe you have sort of an ally on the board that can help you walk through some of those things.
That sounds like a great idea.
And the other thing I was thinking too, and I don't think this is on our onboarding guide, but we might add it, is what do you think about asking for the lead administrator's last evaluation, so that you understand, if it's built around goal setting and those sorts of things, what is ahead for the school and for the lead administrator? Yeah,
I think that can be very handy once you've gotten through those foundation documents, to kind of go another layer into the key things like the lead administrator's status, the school's recent academic performance status, current financial status, those kinds of things, to just give you a grounding on kind of where is the school now in its developmental trajectory, how strong is it, where might be the soft points, where the board needs to focus attention, that sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to kind of get steeped in that, so that you can make your decisions from a basis of knowledge as a board member. So I want to ask you then a little bit more about comparing and contrasting traditional districts with charter schools today. So we talked about the mega waiver's been eroded a little, so there are maybe more similarities than maybe Gary K. Hart hoped for in 1992. But can we talk a little bit about that, the differences and the similarities between traditional districts and charter schools today? Yeah. There are a number of similarities. Some of the laws that govern both school districts and charter schools in either the same or very similar ways. But as I noted previously, some of the key differences are just the ability to really focus and operate your school in pursuit of a very defined instructional mission. and to do so with a higher degree of flexibility than school districts enjoy. Second, this ability to back that independence with the legal and governance independence of the charter school corporation. Again, underscoring the important role that governing boards play, particularly in the charter sector. There are some other big differences. You know better than I, Catlin, having served on both the traditional governing board of a school district as well as a charter governing board. School district governing boards stand for public election as a governmental agency. And while that can have some great strengths in the democratic process, it also tends to yield a rather random assemblage of board members, whereas in the charter sector, boards have the opportunity in most cases to really carefully assemble a board, almost like you're building one great brain, if you will, to govern the organization out of several different individuals. And you can think through key issues about, who has financial expertise, who has legal expertise, who has school management expertise, and how can we draw and establish a coherent, unified board that really believes in our school's mission and vision. And that is something that's very difficult, if not impossible, to do within the traditional school district sector.
Absolutely. I think the motivations of folks who want to serve on a charter school board and the motivations of folks who want to run for elected office and serve on a traditional school board can be very different. And I think the charter school board members are usually really motivated by their love for that school and the mission and the vision of the school and wanting to make it better. So that's a real positive for charter school boards. So if we're sort of moving, we talked about 1992, and so we're 30 plus years from the inception of charter schools and the idea of charter schools. So where are we today? How does the charter school landscape look? If I'm on a school board, in an area of California that maybe doesn't have a lot of other charter schools, what does the rest of California look like in terms of charter schools?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting 30 plus years, and I never could have imagined back in 1992 the phenomenal success and momentum that we currently have in California's charter sector. We have over 1,300 charter schools in California, serving upwards of 750,000 students at the time we've recorded this. The overwhelming majority of these schools are very successful. And we've observed a lot of very successful innovation on many fronts: instructional, operational, governance-wise, facilities-wise, etc. And we see continued growth in that student enrollment statewide, despite the fact that student enrollment in K-12 schools statewide is declining year over year. We've had continued growth in the charter sector. We do, however, have pretty strong and continued opposition even 30 years into our charter quote-unquote experiment in California, particularly from those who are ardent advocates of the traditional district-only system, whether it's traditional school board members or traditional-minded school board members or school administrators, and especially opposition from public employee unions who represent the staff in traditional districts who are very fearful of the competition that charter schools or co-opetition that charter schools often bring to the table. So it's in many ways a very positive picture when you look within the charter sector itself in California, but at times a challenging one when you look at the placement of charter schools in the larger political system.
Well, and you're absolutely right. And I think that's a great reason to think about why charter school board members should be advocates for charter schools, because we know that traditional coalition has all sorts of supporters and voices and everything from employee unions to administrative administrative organizations that speak on behalf of their interests as a traditional district. And so really, I think, it's a good opportunity. And in one of our other episodes, we talk a lot more about advocacy, but it's a good opportunity to remind charter school board members that we want them to join us on our mission to keep charter schools thriving in California. So let's sort of circle back then to I'm a new board member. I've got my foundational documents. What are my opportunities, threats? What are my potential goals? What things should I be looking forward to? I've read all the documents. I've got my mentor. I'm at my first meeting. I understand how it's run. And sort of now, what do I need to look for?
Yeah, I think the key thing that you want to focus on as a charter board member should always be your North Star is your school or are your schools, if you're in a multi-school organization, delivering a fantastic educational opportunity for the students and families that you directly serve? That's kind of your North Star. And you'll be looking to your student achievement data, both the school level data as well as statewide assessment data relative to your school, and looking to see, are your students making strong growth year over year? And serving on a charter school governing board can be really a fantastic opportunity to both serve the students that you directly serve within your school, but also to build an institution that's strengthening your local community. There are a lot of challenges that board members in charter schools face, some of them political, some of them practical. On the practical end, schools are complicated and require very careful governance oversight to attend to sound management, sound instructional policies, sound personnel and HR policies, as well as making sure that your school is documenting strong growth and student achievement over time. Then add on top of that the legal compliance, fiscal sustainability, and other challenges that we talked about. And you add all of that up, and being a board member and a charter school leader, charter school administrator is not an easy job, but there are a lot of resources out there to help you. On the political end, yes, you're correct. Chartering faces strong opposition, and it often feels like a bit of a David and Goliath type of political battle in Sacramento. And charter opposition does remain fierce, both at the state level and in some local areas. And as a board member, you just need to be prepared to face up to that opposition from time to time. Some of the resources that we have available can help you to do that. And over time, I think we're seeing increased acceptance on the part of the public. If you look at public opinion data, there is strong and growing support for charter schools, in part due to the advocacy work that charter school board members do.
Absolutely, yeah. And if we, as we sort of wind up this episode today, if I'm a new charter school board member, or even if I've been on a charter school board for a while, what sort of words of wisdom do you have as not only a veteran in the legislative arena, but also as a veteran charter school board member? What sort of words of wisdom would you have for new board members as they take on this task?
Yeah, as I reflect, I think I've spent maybe 20 years in total on charter boards. I'm currently not serving as one, but it is so rewarding to talk to students and families who are being served. Many of them have very powerful and articulate anecdotes and stories about what the school has done for them, how it's transformed their lives. And I now serve on the board of an organization that has a couple of former students who have grown up and whose careers have been measurably aided and their lives deeply enriched by the experience that they had at the charter school. And they now have joined charter school governing boards themselves and sort of completing the cycle. So this can be just a tremendous, rich and rewarding experience. It doesn't always go well. There are times where schools run into trouble, times where being a board member, frankly, isn't fun. But for the most part, I think most board members will find it a tremendously rewarding and enriching experience if they really dig in and lean into the experience.
I completely agree. And thank you so much for all of your thoughts on our topic today and your words of wisdom. I hope new board members really do take that to heart. Thank you, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you.
This has been Boarding Pass from CSDC, the Charter Schools Development Center. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. And share this podcast with your charter school board member friends. View today's show notes. We took notes for you at chartercenter.org/boardingpass. Thanks as always to Greg Hall, Mike Watson, Melissa Cabral, and CSDC founder and executive director, Eric Premack. We'll see you next time on Boarding Pass.
Now that you've got your boarding pass to effective charter school governance, why not upgrade to first class? By becoming a member of the Charter Schools Development Center, you'll gain year-round access to expert guidance, cutting-edge resources, and a network of experienced charter advisors. CSDC membership is your fast track to excellence in charter school governance, offering personalized support and professional development opportunities that will help you and your school soar to new heights. Go to chartercenter.org/membership to learn more.